last portion of our notes on the Renaissance. Remember that at home you can skip ahead to anything that you need if you're gone for our notes. Today, we're going to do Renaissance writers. And if you take a look at these pictures of these guys, remember that the word Renaissance means what? Rebirth. Good job. So if you look at this, they're rebirthing the old ideas of the Greeks and Romans. And you'll notice that a couple of them even dressed like the old Greeks. See how they have these laurel leaves on their head and stuff? That is a Greek thing. So they were very obsessed with that era, and they actually read a lot of the stuff that they wrote during the Greek era. So let's learn a little bit about these guys. Now, I'm going to give you a key word to remember each of them for your test, because they are all very unique. They have a certain specialty that they're good at. So let's start with Dante Alighieri. Dante is most commonly known by his first name, Dante, okay? And he wrote the book, The Divine Comedy. He is known as our traveler, because in his book, they are traveling. But where they're going is not where you and I would typically go on our vacation. They're going to 3 places. They're going to heaven, purgatory, and hell. Now, the main character is himself, which is kind of unique. Dante is the main character. And he is being guided by the poet Virgil. There's a couple of things that you'd find in this book, and this is what made it so popular. This is why people bought this book and wanted to read it. It's kind of like the Hunger Games or something in their day, all right? The first thing he does is he does name dropping. It would be like me writing my life story and saying, yeah, and then when I went on this vacation in California, I ran into Channing Tatum and he asked me out on a date. But of course I was married, so I said no. And then, I went to this restaurant, and wouldn't you believe that like Beyonce was there, and we actually did a little rap together. It was awesome. Dropping famous names. Well, that's what he does in this book. But think about it. Where is he going? This isn't on earth, right? So what do you think it means if I said, yeah, I ran into President Obama when I was in hell, right? He's making a political statement, isn't he, about where certain people are going to end up in the afterlife. So that was part of the interest or the intrigue of reading this book, because you'd find Michelangelo in a certain place or so-and-so in another place. He also wrote it in the vernacular of the day. Does anybody know what vernacular is? Vernacular? And it was so freaking hot. And so we hung out and stuff. What do you suppose it is? Sassy dialect, like slang. It's slang. It's the way you talk. You guys have already read Shakespeare already in English class, right? And you know how hard that language can be, right? He wasn't about that. He wanted this book to be easy to read, so he wrote it just like they talked, which made it kind of fun for people to read. Now, as he went through his experience here, the most famous part of the book is this one right here in hell. It's called Dante's Inferno. Any of you recognize that? Dante's Inferno? Yeah. Where have you heard that before? You remember? I know there's a couple of video games based on this in Dante's Inferno. Now think about it. What do you think Inferno means? Fire, yes. And you think about the flames of hell, right? So makes sense that that's hell. Good. So there are some video games out on this. There are paintings that have been done, all kinds of stuff. If you take an English class, if anything, you're going to read this part of the book, probably the third part. And if you look at this painting here, this is actually in your textbook, you'll see that they are representing the last portion, Dante's Inferno. Here you have the poet Virgil as our guide. And the way that he portrayed hell was like a birthday cake, kind of. You see it in the background here? He believed that there were levels of hell. depending on what you did. So, for example, maybe your serial killers are here, and maybe cheating husbands are like here, and maybe lying to your parents is like here or something. I don't know. But obviously, the worse thing you did, the worse the level of hell. So, kind of interesting. All right, let's take a look at our next guy. Petrarch, you read about him in our book. He was the humanist who was all about education and using his knowledge to help the world. Do you remember that in your textbook? Petrarch is our lover. He was a lover, not a fighter. Because he was a poet. He wrote poetry. Almost everything that he wrote in Latin. The only things that he wrote in his home language of Italian were his sonnets. Anybody know what is a sonnet? Yeah, it's a type of poem. I don't remember all the numbers and whatnot, but yeah, it's a type of poem. Now, you guys are going to say, well, Italian is based on Latin, right? Yeah. So it is definitely similar, but he did use different languages when he wrote. Some of the pieces that he's most known for, he is known for a series of letters to Laura, they're called. And actually, they're poem letters, basically, to Laura. He also did an autobiography about himself called To Posterity, but he's most famous for the Canzoniere. C-A-N-Z-O-N-I-E-R-E. The Canzoniere. The word canzoniere means love songs. And this is a series of 366 love poems. So I know that February is coming up here in a couple weeks, and Valentine's Day is coming up in a few days, right? So gentlemen, here's a little tip for you. Check out the canzoniere. You can write it in your own handwriting. Give it to the girl that you like. She'll be so impressed by your romanticism. A little tip for you. He's a great one to look for. You'll love it. See, he's the lover. He knows what to do to catch the girl. So, all right, our next guy is Giovanni Boccaccio. What does he sound Italian? Mr. Boccaccio. Boccaccio is our graphic guy. And by graphic, I mean gross. So here's why he's called the graphic guy. He wrote a book called The Decameron, kind of like the name Cameron with D-E in front of it. Decameron. This is a story about a group of friends fleeing Florence. Try that tongue twister 3 times. Friends fleeing Florence. So the question is, why are they fleeing Florence? Because of the plague. Dun, dun, dun. And it follows their travels on their journey. And of course, everywhere they stop, people are dropping like flies from the plague, and they're trying to escape it. So the thing that's unique about Boccaccio's story, however, is nobody had ever heard of a writer that described things in great detail, especially when it came to gross stuff. So he would say things like, and his skin flaked off in oozy pustules of flesh and blah, blah, blah. And the dead bodies rotted and rats were running through their eyes and, just really gory, graphic stuff. I mean, people were like dying to see this and read it because they had never seen anything like it. So kind of reminds me of horror movies nowadays, It's kind of new. So that's Boccaccio. Our fourth guy is Baldassare Castiglione. Sounds like a dinner. He's my favorite. He wrote the Libro del Cortegiano, which means the book of the courtier. The book of the courtier. He is our how-to guy. You know how we have books like how to build a computer, how to play football, how to write a book. He has a how-to book. So the question is, what is he telling us to do? His topic is how to catch a girl. This is a dating manual. And I tell you that every guy in that day that had a penny in their pocket was buying this book and reading it, because it was telling them how to catch that girl that everybody else wanted in town. That was the cutest, hottest, most brilliant girl there. That's the girl they were going after. And it was a hard thing to do. So he had a list of things that they had to do. Now, before we find out what Castiglione put on his list, we're going to find out what you would put on your list. So girls, we are going to listen as the gentlemen tell us what they think girls are looking for in a guy. And then once we've listened, then we'll tell them the truth, and we'll tell them what you are looking for in a gentleman, all right? And we'll see if they match up with his ideas, okay? Yeah, the car won't be on there probably. So now what we're gonna do is let's see if Baldassare had the same ideas as you. Gentlemen, see if you make the cut here, all right? The first thing he said is you had to be academic. Now that didn't mean you had to be like a 4.0 brilliant scientist, but you have to be studious and smart, so that if she brings up something, you're not gonna go, oh, I don't know what that is, like my date in high school, right? Okay, all right. They said you had to be spiritual. We didn't mention that. Okay, raise your hand if your mate, it's important to you that your mate is like a Christian. Raise your hand if that's important to you. Okay, yeah. Like what girls want, you mean, or? I would say they're referring to academics like as in studious subjects, but I think he would also say that you need to be intuitive into what a girl wants as well. Yes. Oh, no, probably not there, no. But, yeah. Yeah, probably not makeup, but it would definitely be things like, okay, what's happening in Iraq right now, that kind of stuff. So, and notice there were some of you that said spirituality does matter. That's kind of interesting. Good.
I don't think it really matters because honestly, I believe in God and all that, but I don't go to church.
Yeah.
So I don't think it really matters.
It's not as important as it was back then, boy. It was like one of the key features. I mean, even when my parents were dating in the 1960s, early 60s, she couldn't marry someone who was Catholic because she was a Protestant. How crazy is that today? But it was very much kind of defined by your religion. So we don't have that as much today, do we? You also had to be physically fit. We had that, didn't we? Yep, need to be active and physically fit. Now these I don't think we had in our list. You had to be a good dancer. Is that important today? Is it? Yes? No? Yes? No? A little bit? Because obviously at these places you're going with this lady, she's a noble woman. She's going to want to dance. And you can't say no because she's not going to like it. So, and I will tell you, gentlemen, not that you would do it here at school, but you know how when you go out dancing, you're like grinding on each other and all that stuff? Okay, we're not talking that kind of dancing. We're talking if you can take a girl and do like the two-step with her, it is the sexiest thing, guys. Seriously, you need to learn how to do that because there's nothing better than a guy that can lead a lady around the dance floor and treat her like a lady. Just a little tip for you. Well, it's kind of like the waltz, only you do it with country music. So you'll find that as you go to weddings, an option. So just telling you, it might be a nice thing. Also, you need to be instrument or sing, more power to you. But if you can't do that, then you needed to at least know music. So you would know the top musicians, the top songs. So again, if she brings it up, you can talk intelligently about it. Same thing with art. If you were an artist, boy, you got a plus and you got the chicks. But if you weren't an artist, then you need Chapel and Da Vinci and all those things and be able to talk intelligently. because it was all about making her comfortable. And hopefully you would catch the girl of your dreams. Cool. All right. Now we just talked about all Italian writers. We're going to go to the north now, and we're going to go in particular to Germany and England and Holland. And we'll see some influence there from the Renaissance. This is Albrecht Dürer, and by looking at his name, where is he from? He is German. You can tell by the little umlaut, right? That's going to be a key for you on your test, so remember that. Yes, he was known for woodcuts. A copy of a woodcut, but he would carve these things into wood pieces. They're just absolutely beautiful. And again, you'll notice the techniques. We've got depth, shading, individual faces, the nudity of the body, all that stuff. On in the north, they were not about worshiping God in everything you did in England and Germany. So they didn't catch on with that part of it, but everything else they did. Our next guy is Hans Holbein the Younger. And if you see the younger, you obviously know that there is an older, right? His dad was also a painter, but he is known as much more talented than his father. He was known for doing portraits. He was a very good portraitist. This is probably his most famous. He did the portrait of King Henry VIII. Not nearly as cute as the guys that portray him in movies. But anything I have read about Henry says that he was really a good-looking guy when he was young. That's why he had all those wives. And then as he got older, he got a little chubbier, a little more beard and all that stuff. But he was supposedly very good-looking when he was young. So this is a German painter. Okay. Let me just make sure I got everything you need there. Oh, I have a couple other things too. So he also did some woodcuts. He did 41 of them called the Dance of Death. Real positive thing. But this is the interesting thing. He actually did the illustrations for Martin Luther's Bible. Remember, Martin Luther starts the Lutheran movement? We're going to get into that next week. He was the one that made the pictures in the very first Lutheran Bible that was written in the people's language, in German. Otherwise, it was always done in another language. This guy here is named Jan van Eyck. Anybody know where you're from if you have a van in front of your last name? Holland. Yep, he's Dutch. Good for you. If you see Von, V-O-N, that's German. But Van is very Dutch. If you go to northwest Iowa, you'll see lots of Van Hefties, Van Whites, a lot of van names. My name, Terpstra, the S-T-R-A ending is a Dutch ending. My husband's full-blood Dutch. So this guy was from Holland, and he is most known, and you'll probably study him in some of your art classes. He is the first guy to ever use oil painting. You know, there's, watercolor, there's all different kinds of paint. He was the first to use oil paints. So a lot of his stuff is very bright. You'll see this is an altarpiece in a chapel. And supposedly, this is actually his self-portrait right here, the man in a turban. Now, along with our Italian writers, we also have some famous writers from the Renaissance that spread throughout the rest of Europe. Most of them were from England. So let's take a look at some of these names. You might have heard of them. Chaucer, he wrote the story of the Canterbury Tales. You maybe have heard of that, or you'll probably read it sometime in your life in some English class. It's pretty famous. Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia. You ever heard that word, Utopia? What does it mean?
Like when you all live together or something like that?
Yes, you live together in harmony and peace, and everybody's happy. Everybody's giving and sharing, and it's a really interesting book. Of all the books I read in college, this was probably the best. I have it over here. It's actually a really short read, and he had this faith in the world that we could all eventually get along and share, and it would be a beautiful utopia. We still use that word today. In fact, just this morning I was watching Charmed, the three witches on TV, and they just had an episode about utopia, where these avatars came in and got rid of all the evil in the world, so everything was happy. But the problem was they had to get rid of anything that was evil, including people, and it gave you no choice. So they chose rather to have freedom of choice than to have perfection and no evil in the world. But that's kind of what it's based on. Now, I have to tell you, since I taught this last semester, I have been watching this series, and Thomas More was not a nice guy. I found out he's kind of a jerk. During this movie series, he is burning Lutherans at the stake for being Lutheran. Not a nice guy. And he eventually ends up dying the same way because his king goes against the Catholics, and he's a devout Catholic. So I saw a different side to him. I'm not sure what I think of him anymore. Spencer wrote The Fairy Queen, but we have some playwrights. The most famous, you know, is Shakespeare, of course. Shakespeare is probably the most famous Renaissance writer of all, right? He's the one that you read in your English classes and you know. And you'll even find in some of his subjects that he is using the old Greek and Roman ideas. Like he wrote a play called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. It's a comedy, and it's about, of course, the old Greek Roman idea and stuff. So, yeah. So what is the overall impact of the Renaissance? We've talked about it throughout. Can you imagine what paintings would be like without depth, individual faces, perspective, shading? I mean, we'd look like coloring books nowadays, right? Without the Renaissance, you would not be important. This is really the beginning of democracy because an individual means something in the Renaissance. So that's where this kind of gets hatched. Look at the buildings that came out of this. Without this, we wouldn't have domes on our capitals even. So lots of cool things, lots of brilliance came from this time period. The end.